The desert had a way of swallowing sound, of quieting the world until even one's heartbeat seemed too loud. Elias Crow had grown used to that silence. He depended on it. His cabin sat miles from the nearest settlement, perched on a rise of red earth that overlooked a valley of wind-bent sagebrush and fading buffalo trails. It was a small place, more a fortified refuge than a home, but it suited a man who had spent years trying to outrun memories that still tracked him like hounds. Every evening, Elias followed a ritual as precise as a soldier's: feed the mare, stack the wood, check the traps, bolt the doors. The dusk light filtered through the cabin window in thin strips as the sun dipped, turning everything copper and then bruised violet. On this particular evening, he was sharpening his old hunting knife, letting the rhythmic scrape anchor him to the present. He did not expect visitors. No one came out this far. No one dared. That's why the knock startled him so deeply. It wasn't loud. It wasn't frantic. It was just wrong. Too soft for a bandit, too deliberate for a traveler desperate for help. A measured knock, someone who had rehearsed their courage before approaching his door. Elias froze mid-motion, fingers tightening around the handle of the knife. For a long moment he listened. He had learned to read danger in silence. The whisper of boots in dust, the click of a rifle bolt, the tremble of someone trying to mask fear. But outside his door there was nothing, only wind scraping across the porch boards. He rose silently, placing the knife on the table. His revolver was already within reach. He took it, approached the door, and positioned himself slightly to the side, just in case. The second knock came, just as gentle, but with a subtle tremor this time. "Who is it?" His voice was gravel and used. A long pause. Then a woman's voice, hoarse and tired, answered. "My name is Marin Hale. Please, I need your help." Elias did not open the door yet. Names meant nothing out here unless tied to danger or debts. "How do you know my cabin?" "I asked in town," she said quickly. "They told me you lived alone, that you didn't like visitors. But they also said you were the only man who wouldn't turn me away." He almost laughed, hardly a warm reputation to carry. Elias Crow, the man too cold to lie, too hard to be bribed, too broken to be softened. But something in her voice stirred an unease in him. Desperation, yes. Exhaustion, certainly. But there was a steadiness beneath it, a strength that had carried her through whatever road had led her to his porch. He unlatched the first bolt, then the second. The door creaked open, revealing a woman who looked as though she had wrestled with the desert itself. Dust coated her clothes, her boots were cracked, and her braid hung loose over one shoulder. Her face was pale under the dirt, but her eyes, sharp, searching, carried a resolve that unsettled him. She wasn't trembling out of fear. She was trembling because she had pushed herself beyond her limit. Elias studied her for several seconds more. "You're far from town. You could have died out here." "I would have," she answered, "if I hadn't reached your door before nightfall." Her words carried the weight of something terrible, something urgent. He stepped back, letting her inside. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, with a mixture of hope and sorrow that pierced straight through the armor he had spent years crafting. "I need you to help me find my brother," she whispered. "And if you don't, he won't live to see another sunrise." And in that moment, the hardest man in the desert felt the first crack in the walls he thought would never break. The interior of Elias Crow's cabin was sparse, more shadows than furnishings, but to Marin Hale, it must have felt like sanctuary after miles of merciless desert. She stood just inside the doorway, clutching the strap of her torn satchel, her breathing uneven from exhaustion. Elias shut the door quietly behind her, though his eyes never left her face. A lifetime of danger had trained him to search for deception in the slightest twitch of a brow, the faintest shift in posture. But what he saw in Marin wasn't deceit. It was terror wrapped in determination. "Sit," he said gruffly, gesturing toward the single chair at his table. She obeyed, lowering herself with the care of someone who had walked too far on legs ready to give out. Elias poured her a tin cup of water. When she lifted it to her lips, her hands shook, not delicately, like some faint-hearted girl, but from sheer depletion. Her eyes flicked up to him as she drank, as though afraid that taking her attention off him, even for a second, might break the fragile chance she had fought so hard to reach. When she finished, Elias crossed his arms. "Now talk." She nodded, bracing herself. "My brother, John. He's 14. He's missing." Elias felt something tighten in his chest, but he kept his face unreadable. "Missing how?" "He ran," she said softly. "And he wasn't supposed to. He saw something he shouldn't have. Something men were willing to kill him for." With that, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a scrap of fabric, a torn piece of a coat sleeve. Elias recognized the stitching immediately. His jaw locked. The insignia was faint now, worn from years of sun and sweat, but unmistakable. A curved black raven. A mark he once wore himself. Marin saw the flicker in his eyes. "You know them." "I knew them," he corrected sharply. "Years ago." "But they're hunting my brother now," she pressed, leaning forward. "They chased us out of our homestead. We ran for days." John, he blamed himself for what happened. One night, he just disappeared. "I tracked him until the prince vanished in a dry wash." Her voice hitched. "Asked every ranch, every camp, every store. And every trail led here to you. People said you used to ride with those men. That you know how they think. How they hunt." Elias's silence was answer enough. "They said," she continued, "that if there's anyone alive who can track them, it's you." He felt the old weight return, like iron chained across his shoulders. Those men were phantoms from a past he had buried in shallow ground. Men he once called brothers, before betrayal tore everything apart and left Elias crawling from the ashes of his former life. He didn't want to see their faces again. He didn't want to dig up the graves of his sins. So he shook his head. "I'm not that man anymore." Marin's expression collapsed, not into despair, but into a kind of quiet devastation. A wound reopening. "I walked for 2 days without sleep to get here," she whispered. "I followed a map drawn by strangers, trusted roads I'd never seen, crossed land I had no right to cross, because everyone said you were the one person who wouldn't let a child die." Her voice cracked. "And you're telling me I was wrong?" Elias looked away. He had survived by shutting doors, cutting ties, and believing that the world beyond his porch was no longer his concern. But hearing her say those words, "He's the only one who wouldn't let a child die," stirred embers he thought long since turned to ash. He still didn't answer. Marin set the fabric scrap on the table with trembling fingers. "If you say no, then I'll keep looking alone. Because John is all I have left." Her eyes, hollowed by dust and miles and fear, lifted to meet his. And in that moment he knew. Her plea had broken something inside him, something he'd believed unbreakable. Night settled thick over the valley, the kind of darkness that seemed to press through the very seams of the cabin. Elias Crow lay awake on his narrow cot, staring up at the rafters as the desert wind slipped through cracks in the wood, carrying the cold with it. Outside, the world was silent. Inside, his mind was anything but. Marin Hale slept in the next room, curled beneath a patched blanket he had pulled from storage. She had fallen asleep almost instantly, her body surrendering the moment it discovered safety, but Elias could not close his eyes without seeing ghosts. The scrap of code on his table, the raven insignia, glowed in his memory like a brand. Years ago, he rode with the men who wore it proudly. Men who lived by a code as sharp as their rifles. They hunted criminals, protected caravans, and believed themselves righteous. Elias believed it too, until the line between justice and cruelty blurred beneath their boots. He remembered the last raid vividly. A mistake. An ambush. A bloodbath. And afterward, the betrayal, his brothers turning on him, blaming him, hunting him through the wilderness like wounded prey. They had found him, punished him, and taken something from him he could never reclaim. His family. He had buried them with his own hands. That was the day Elias Crow died and the hermit who lived in this cabin was born. And now, Marin's words had torn open the grave. He turned over in bed, restless, angry at her for coming, angrier at himself for listening. He didn't want to care. Caring was the first step toward losing everything again. He told himself that helping her was a mistake, that getting involved would drag him back into a past made of gunfire and guilt. But no matter how he tried to shut it out, he kept seeing her face, dust-streaked, determined, trembling with fear but refusing to break. He kept hearing her voice. "John is all I have left." He knew that feeling too well. Elias sat up, unable to bear the weight pressing on his chest. He walked to the table where the torn fabric lay like a wound. Moonlight seeped through a slanted window, illuminating it. His hand hovered above it, fingers curling into a fist. He had left that life behind. He had sworn never to track those men again. But the truth was undeniable. No one else alive knew their methods the way he did. No one else knew the way they moved across the desert, the way they set traps, the way they hid their trails. No one else could find the boy before the mercenaries did. Elias let out a slow, heavy breath. A 14-year-old boy against men like them. It wasn't a fight. It was a countdown. He walked to the door and opened it just a crack. Night air swept in, cold and sharp. The desert stretched before him, solemn and unforgiving. Stars glittered like distant campfires, beautiful, unreachable. This was the life he had chosen. Solitude, silence, distance from everything that once mattered. But now a stranger had crossed that desert to find him. And she had brought a truth he could not ignore. Running from his past hadn't saved anyone. Not himself. Not his family. And now not her brother. He closed the door gently, then moved to Marin's room. She didn't wake when he stepped inside. Exhaustion had claimed her completely. Her face, in sleep, looked younger, strained but hopeful. Elias felt something twist inside him, something like recognition. She was the kind of person his old self would have sworn to protect, the kind of person he had failed before. His hand trembled slightly as he rested it on the doorframe. The decision was already made. Before dawn's first light crept into the cabin, Elias Crow stood beside Marin's cot, dressed, armed, and steady. "Wake up," he said quietly. Her eyes fluttered open, confused. "We ride in an hour," he told her. "We're going to find your brother." Shock, relief, and disbelief collided in her expression, but he didn't let her speak. He had already turned to prepare. Because the ghosts he'd spent years hiding from, he was finally riding out to face them. The sun had barely risen when Elias and Marin set out, its pale light stretching long shadows across the desert floor. The world was still cool, painted in soft pinks and morning gold, but Elias knew the heat would come fast, merciless, unforgiving, like the men they were hunting. He rode ahead on his mare, silent and focused, while Marin followed on a borrowed gelding, her posture straight despite the exhaustion that clung to her. Their trail began where all desperate journeys begin, a half-vanished set of footprints. Elias dismounted and knelt in the dirt, brushing dust aside with careful fingers. The prints were small, light, boys' prints. John's. Elias traced them with a precision that came from years of tracking both criminals and comrades. He read the ground like scripture. The direction John had run, how fast, how often he stumbled. He was scared, Elias murmured. Marin slid off her horse. "How can you tell?" Elias pointed to the deep toe prints. "That's the weight of someone running from something behind him, not toward something ahead." He rose and looked west. But he had a purpose. He wasn't wandering. Marin followed his gaze, her expression tightening. He was trying to reach the old trail road. "We used it when we left home." "He didn't make it," Elias said quietly, because John's tracks didn't go that far. They were interrupted, broken by the unmistakable signs of horses. 2 riders. Heavy boots. A long pause where John's print stopped. Marin's breath hitched. They took him. Elias didn't answer. She already knew. He stood, dusting off his hands. "We're not far behind." And so they rode once more. Hours passed as they followed the trail through scrubland and over rocky ridges. Along the way, Marin asked questions, careful, hesitant at first, then bolder as she learned how Elias read the land. How do you know where they turned? The horses favored their left hooves. That means they were avoiding rocky ground. How do you know John is still alive? The mercenaries need leverage. They'll keep him breathing until they decide what message they want to send. That last line hit her hard. Elias saw her jaw tighten, fury and fear braided together, but she pushed through it. She rode closer to him, her face set with resolve that would have impressed even the hardened men Elias once knew. They reached a dry creek bed where the tracks vanished into scattered gravel. Elias slowed, scanning the ground with eyes honed by years of surviving on instinct. He dismounted, walking a slow, deliberate arc until he found what he needed: a broken twig, a scuff mark, a strand of fabric caught on thorn brush. They went north, he said, toward the old stagecoach line, toward danger. By late afternoon, the heat was oppressive, rising in waves that distorted the horizon. Marin's horse snorted, stumbling from exhaustion. Elias called for a halt beneath a rocky outcrop offering a sliver of shade. While Marin drank from her canteen, Elias studied her, not out of curiosity, but because he needed to know what kind of person he was bringing into a fight. She was weary, sunburned, and still unsteady from her long trek. But her spirit hadn't cracked once. Not when they found John's prince. Not when she learned the mercenaries had him. Not even now, under the punishing sun. "You hold up better than most," Elias said, surprising himself. Marin looked up, surprised too. "I don't have the luxury of breaking." He nodded once. He respected that more than words could say. When they resumed riding, the landscape changed. More burnt grass, more disturbed earth. The first sign of something wrong came as they crested a hill and saw smoke curling faintly in the distance. Elias urged his mare forward, his pulse quickening. Marin followed, dread building with every stride. At the base of the hill lay the charred skeleton of a stagecoach. Its wheels melted into the soil, its cargo scattered in the ashes. Buzzards circled above, their shadows sweeping across the wreckage like warnings. Marin gasped. "Oh God." Elias scanned the scene with a cold, practiced eye. Fresh hoof prints, drag marks, blood on the dirt, but no small body. No boy. "They were here less than 3 hours ago," Elias said, voice hardening. "And they're not alone. They've got supplies. Maybe more men. They're preparing for something." He turned to Marin, eyes narrowing. "They know we're following." Her face paled, but her chin lifted with resolve. "Then we don't stop," she said. And Elias, against every instinct he'd buried, felt something almost like pride. They rode on, because now the hunt had truly begun. The land began to change as Elias and Marin rode deeper into the broken country north of the burned stagecoach. The ground dipped into sharp ravines and twisting gullies carved by centuries of flash floods. Narrow paths wound between stone walls, some no wider than a horse's flanks. Elias slowed their pace, every sense sharpened. "This place is wrong," he murmured. Marin scanned the terrain. "Wrong how?" Elias lifted a hand, signaling her to stop speaking. The silence in the ravines was too perfect, no wind moaning through cracks, no birds nesting in the rocks, no insects buzzing. The desert breathed differently in places where danger lingered, and Elias had learned to listen to that breath. He dismounted quietly and motioned for Marin to stay on her horse. "Is it them?" she whispered, gripping the reins tighter. "It's something," he replied. "And in these canyons, something is always bad." He knelt to the ground, brushing his fingers over faint grooves in the dust. Not natural. Not old. Fresh drag lines, fresh hoof prints. Someone had passed through this exact ravine just hours ago, and they had wanted whoever followed to walk right into a trap. Elias cursed under his breath. He looked up at Marin. "Ride close to me. Don't stop for anything. If I tell you to run, you run." She nodded, fear flickering through her eyes, but also trust. That trust hit him harder than he expected. They pressed forward, the gully closing around them like the throat of a beast. The ambush sprang like a rattler. A gunshot cracked from above, echoing through the stone walls. Elias's horse reared as a bullet struck the ground inches from its hooves. He grabbed the reins, steadying the mare just as shouting erupted from both sides of the ravine. "Down!" he roared. Marin ducked instinctively as Elias kicked free of his stirrup, rolled behind a boulder, and fired upward. The canyon exploded with sound, gunfire pinging off stone, gravel raining down with every ricochet. Marin clutched her horse's neck, breath shaking. Another bullet tore into the dirt near her boot. "Move!" Elias snapped. "Get behind cover, now!" She dismounted and scrambled behind a jagged rock as bullets rained from above. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She forced herself to stay low, her hands trembling but her mind sharp. Elias fired 3 precise shots, forcing the gunmen to scatter. "2 on the left ridge, 1 on the right," he growled. "And they're not here to scare us." "They think John is with us," Marin whispered. "No," Elias said darkly. "They think I'm alone. And they want me dead." The men shouted to each other, voices masked by the wind. Elias recognized one of them, Harlan Pike, a former comrade with a voice like gravel and morality scraped thin by greed. Hearing him now pulled old anger from Elias's bones. He paused, listening between the echoes. "They're a shift in bootsteps on stone. They're circling down," Elias muttered. "Trying to close us in." Marin swallowed hard. "What do we do?" "We don't let them." He waited until the footsteps reached the lower ledge, then burst from cover with sudden, lethal speed. His gun barked once. A cry echoed from the rocks, followed by the thud of a falling body. The remaining 2 gunmen returned fire, sending shards of stone slicing past Elias's cheek. 1 bullet grazed his arm, tearing through fabric and flesh. He hissed but didn't falter. Marin saw the blood. "Elias." "I've had worse," he snapped, though his face tightened with pain. He took a breath, steadied himself, then fired again. 1 more gunman dropped. The last fled, scrambling across the ridge like a panicked coyote. Elias lowered his weapon, breathing hard. "It's over," Marin whispered. "For now," Elias said. "But they'll regroup. And next time, they won't miss." He staggered slightly, the wound in his arm bleeding freely. Marin rushed to him, tearing a strip from her sleeve to press against the injury. "You need to sit," she insisted. He didn't argue, because the dizziness was already pulling at him. As she tied the makeshift bandage around his arm, the hard lines in his face softened for the briefest moment. "You did good," he murmured. Marin met his gaze, her voice unsteady but fierce. "We're getting John back, whatever it takes." Elias nodded, feeling the weight of her determination settle beside his own. "We will," he said. "But after today, we have to move faster." Because the ambush made one thing clear. The mercenaries weren't just hunting John anymore. They were hunting Elias, and anyone who dared ride with him. By the time Elias and Marin cleared the ravines, the sun was sinking, bleeding red across the horizon. Elias's injured arm throbbed with every heartbeat, but he pushed his mare forward, refusing to slow. If the mercenaries had set an ambush, it meant they were close, and likely regrouping. Marin rode beside him, keeping a watchful eye on his posture. She could see the strain in the set of his jaw, the stiffness in his shoulders. She said nothing at first, knowing pride was sometimes more fragile than flesh. But as the daylight faded entirely, she finally spoke. "We need to stop before you fall out of that saddle." He didn't answer. "Elias," she said more firmly, "you're losing blood." He exhaled, resignation slipping into the breath. "There's an old supply outpost up ahead. If it's still standing, we can shelter there until dawn." It took another half-hour of riding through deepening night before they spotted the silhouette. A crooked wooden structure collapsed against its own weariness. Once a meeting point for travelers, it now looked half-swallowed by sand. But it had walls, a roof, and most importantly, no signs of recent activity. Marin helped Elias dismount. He swayed but remained upright. She noticed dried blood darkening the entire sleeve of his shirt. "Sit," she ordered. He did, reluctantly, as she guided him into the outpost. The interior smelled of dust and old leather. Broken crates lined the walls, and the remnants of a table lay collapsed in the corner. A single window let in moonlight sharp enough to illuminate his wound. Maren knelt in front of him and carefully untied her improvised bandage. The dried cloth peeled away, revealing a long, angry gash carved across his upper arm. "This needs cleaning," she muttered. "The bullet glanced me," he said dryly. "Could have been worse." "You could have been dead," she shot back. He didn't respond, not because he disagreed, but because he felt the truth of it. Maren found a canteen, some cloth from an old tarp, and a small metal tin of leftover salve miraculously still sealed. As she cleaned the wound, Elias didn't flinch, but his eyes softened, quiet, almost grateful. "You've done this before," he said. "Life doesn't give you time to wait for a doctor," she replied. "You learn fast or you lose people." Her voice wavered on the last words. Elias studied her face. There was something in her expression, an exhaustion far deeper than the physical. He realized then that her strength came not from fearlessness, but from necessity. From carrying burdens too heavy for one woman alone. "You did good today," Elias murmured. "You held your ground." She finished securing a clean bandage around his arm. "Fear doesn't stop me," she said softly. "Losing John would." Her eyes met his, raw, fierce, and shining in the pale moonlight. For a moment, the outpost was silent except for the distant howl of a coyote. Elias broke the quiet first. "They won't kill him. Not yet." "Because they want you?" she asked. He nodded. "I left them. They never forgave it. John saw something they needed hidden. He's leverage now. A trap wrapped in a boy." Maren's breath trembled. "So walking into their hands is exactly what they want." "Yes," Elias said. "Which is why we can't. We don't run straight at them. We track around them. Cut their path. Take John before they can use him." Maren nodded slowly, absorbing his plan. "Then we move before dawn." He wasn't expecting her next words. "You're not doing this alone. You understand that, don't you?" He stiffened. "This isn't your fight." "Yes," she interrupted. "It is. He's my brother. And I'll walk beside you, even into danger." Elias looked away, the shadows on his face shifting. He wasn't used to someone choosing to stand with him. Not anymore. "Get some rest," he said finally, his voice rough. "Tomorrow will be worse than today." She curled up near the far wall, exhaustion pulling her down almost instantly. Elias sat against the opposite wall, listening to her breathing steady. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. He watched the moon crawl across the broken roof. Because he knew the truth. Tomorrow was the day they would finally get close enough to see the men hunting the boy. And close enough for those men to see Elias Crow return from his ghosts. The night settled heavily over the valley, a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the cabin, the pines, and even the stars above. Inside the solitary ranch house, the only light came from the fireplace, a wavering, unsteady glow that kept breaking over Elias's face. He sat rigid in his chair, elbows on his knees, his hands laced together as if holding himself still were the only way not to fall apart. Across from him, Mara paced, unable to stop moving, unable to let silence stitch itself between them without filling it with something, anything, before it crushed her. Because now Elias knew. He knew the truth she had hidden, the truth she believed would send him out into the storm rather than stay in the same room with her. He knew she was the reason he had lost his brother. Mara stopped pacing only when her legs trembled. "Say something," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the weight of confession. "Please." Elias didn't look up. If he did, he wasn't sure whether he would break or whether he would say something he could never take back. The embers in the fireplace cracked sharply, echoing in the tight space between them. "You want words?" he asked finally, voice low and raw.
"Fine.
"I got words." Mara's breath caught. "What you told me," he said, "it feels like it's tearing through everything I've built just to stay alive." His jaw tightened. "Everything I buried. Everything I punished myself for." He exhaled shakily. "For years." Mara swallowed hard, her eyes shining with a shimmer of unshed tears. I know what it means. If I could undo. You can't, he said sharply. She flinched. I know, she whispered. But you asked why I came. Why I begged you. Why I told you the truth even though I knew you might hate me. Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. And it's because there is someone else in danger. Someone who didn't choose any of this. And I couldn't let her pay for the sins that belong to people like me. Elias closed his eyes. The memories he had spent years forcing into silent corners roared back to life. Smoke, gunfire, the echo of his brother's voice, the weight of helplessness, the cruel twist of fate that had stolen the one person he had sworn to protect. For so long, Elias had blamed himself. Every night, he had relived that loss with quiet fury. And now, suddenly, he learned that the woman standing 3 feet away from him, trembling and barefoot, had been there, had seen it, had been part of it. You don't understand, Mara said softly. I didn't come to ask forgiveness. I didn't come to ease my conscience. I came because your brother, he tried to save me that night. And I couldn't save him back. Elias's head snapped up. Mara's eyes, haunted, pleading, found his. He told me his name, she whispered, voice breaking. He told me yours. He told me that you were the only person who'd come for him if he didn't make it home. He believed in you until his last breath. The ache in Elias's chest tightened until breathing hurt. And that is why I came to you, she said. Because someone else, my sister, needs the same kind of loyalty he had. The same selflessness. And I know the cost I'm asking you to pay. Tears spilled down her cheeks. But I had no one left to beg but you. Elias stood slowly. The room seemed to shrink around him. He looked at her, not with hatred, not with forgiveness, but with the raw confusion of a man torn in half. You're asking me, he said, to help you save the sister of the woman who helped get my brother killed. Mara nodded silently. Elias stared at her. And the fire crackled on. The morning came reluctantly, as if the sun itself feared shining upon what lay ahead. Elias barely slept, just moments of drifting before jagged memories jolted him awake again. Mara slept even less. Whenever he stirred, he saw her sitting by the window, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the horizon, as though she were trying to will her sister into safety by sheer force of longing. When dawn finally crept over the mountains, Elias stood and strapped on the old gun belt he hadn't worn in years. The leather had stiffened with neglect, but the weight of it settled against his hips with unsettling familiarity. Mara watched him from across the room, wary, as though uncertain whether his readiness meant he had chosen to stand with her, or against her. He didn't speak at first. He checked the rifle, filled the saddlebags, tied down provisions. Mara waited silently, her breath held like a prayer she didn't dare say aloud. Only when he reached the barn door did he pause. You're sure she's still at that camp? He asked, voice even but cold. Mara nodded. If they haven't moved yet. And this man, this captain you mentioned, he's the one who took her? Mara's expression twisted with a mix of fear and loathing. He's not a real captain. Just a man who once had authority and now abuses whatever scraps remain. He likes power. And he likes obedience. Elias didn't ask for more details, but the way she said the word obedience made something inside him tighten. He clenched his jaw, fists flexing once before he forced the tension out of them. They saddled up, his old stallion, Dust, and the smaller chestnut mare he had offered her. Mara climbed into the saddle with competent ease. She might have looked fragile in the dim firelight the night before, but in the morning sun, there was something steel-like beneath her quietness. As they rode out, the crisp mountain air stung their lungs. Pines whispered overhead, their branches trembling in the breeze. The trail sloped downward toward the valley, where the land widened into open plains stretching toward the abandoned military outpost Mara had described. For a long while, they rode in silence. Elias finally spoke. You left something out last night. Mara stiffened. I left many things out. I mean something specific. His gaze stayed on the trail ahead. When my brother died, there was no body. He wasn't buried. You never said what happened after. Mara's breath hitched, barely audible. I was afraid you'd ask. Ask anyway. She swallowed hard. Here, brother. Help me escape the chaos when the shooting started.
He shielded me.
But when he fell, the men who attacked us took the bodies. All of them. They burned the outpost. Burned every trace. Her voice trembled. I don't know what they did to him afterward. I only know he didn't die alone. A long stretch of trail passed before Elias responded. When he did, his voice was low. You should have told me. All of it. I didn't want you to lose whatever hope you had left. Hope. He gave a bitter, humorless exhale. That died years ago.
She didn't argue.
There was no argument that fit. After several more miles, Mara spoke again, softly. If you want to turn back, I'll understand. I never expected you to come this far. You asked me last night if I would help, Elias interrupted. I didn't answer. Not out loud. Mara looked at him, a fragile fear in her eyes. He kept his gaze fixed forward. I'm riding with you now. That's your answer. And though he said nothing else, the words settled between them, heavy but real. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't trust. But it was a beginning. A dangerous, uncertain beginning that would lead them both back into the darkness that had shaped them. By late afternoon, the land shifted from rugged slopes to a wide, barren stretch of dust and brittle grass. The wind blew low over the plain, carrying with it a faint but distinct smell, smoke, old sweat, and metal. Elias recognized it instantly. He had smelled it on battlefields, on burned-out homesteads, on every place where men gathered to take what wasn't theirs. A camp. A hostile one. They slowed their horses and dismounted behind a cluster of jagged rocks half a mile out. From here, they could see it clearly. The old military outpost sprawled in ruin, its wooden watchtower tilting like a dying animal. Tattered canvas tents flapped in the wind. Barrels, crates, and makeshift barricades lay scattered around the perimeter. And the men. At least 20 of them, rough-looking, restless, armed. Some lounged near the fire pits. Others paced with rifles slung over shoulders. A few played cards under a tarp, the clatter of chips drifting faintly through the wind. Mara scanned every corner, every shadow, her hands trembling. She's in there, she whispered. I can feel it. Elias studied the camp with a soldier's eye, counting guards, noting blind spots, identifying weaknesses. He crouched lower, pinching dirt between his fingers, letting it fall slowly. We can't go in guns blazing, he muttered. They'd kill her. Mara nodded quickly. Then we go in quiet. Elias glanced at her, noticing again that strange blend of fear and resilience. You ever move quiet? Her answer was a surprised, humorless breath. You don't survive men like them without learning how. He accepted that with a slow nod. The two crept closer, staying low through tall grass, weaving between rocks until they reached the remnants of an old supply trench leading toward the camp's outer edge. The sun dipped, casting long shadows that swallowed the outpost in a bruised, purple gloom. They paused near a rusted wagon wheel, the camp now only 20 yards away. Mara pointed subtly. That tent, the one with the dark patch on top. She was dragged there 2 nights ago. Elias studied it. 2 guards sat nearby, lazily tossing pebbles at a bottle. Easy enough to unseat silently, but only if they didn't turn their heads at the same time. What does she look like? Elias asked. Mara swallowed. She's younger than me.
Smaller.
Dark hair. A scar on her left cheek. She's brave, but she won't last long there. The tremor in her voice made Elias look at her fully. You did everything you could to keep her out of this, he said quietly. I can see that. Mara shut her eyes, pained. It wasn't enough. Elias didn't argue. It wasn't his place. But he rested a hand briefly on her arm, grounding her. It was the first time he'd touched her willingly, without anger or tension. Mara looked startled, but steadied by it. They moved forward like shadows. Elias slipped behind the 2 guards. His steps, soft as dust settling, were almost soundless. He grabbed the first man from behind, covering his mouth, choking him out without a struggle. Mara moved with equal precision, surprising Elias again. She struck the second guard with a carefully delivered blow to the temple, lowering him quietly. They dragged the bodies behind the tent. Mara knelt beside the canvas flap, her breath shaking. She hesitated, afraid of what she might, or might not, find inside. Elias watched her struggle, watched the fear twist in her like a blade. He rested a hand on her shoulder. "I'll go first," he said. She nodded, stepping aside. Elias lifted the flap and entered. What he found inside made every muscle in his body turn to stone. Not just shock, not just outrage, but a cold, murderous clarity. Someone inside the tent stirred weakly, and Mara's breath behind him broke into a single, fragile word. Lena. Lena lay inside the tent like a shadow barely clinging to form. Pale, trembling, with bruises blooming across her arms, she looked much younger than Mara had described, as if hardship had stolen whole years from her in a matter of days. At the sound of her sister's voice, her eyelids fluttered open. "Mara?" she whispered, cracked and dry. Mara fell to her knees beside her, choking back a sob as she lifted Lena's face gently. I'm here, little dove. I'm taking you home." Elias gave them a moment, but he couldn't ignore the sounds outside. The shifting boots, the bursts of laughter, the clatter of someone rearranging crates. They had minutes, maybe less. He checked Lena's condition quickly. Weak, but breathing. Could walk with help, but not fast. He looked at Mara. "We need to move." Mara nodded, wiping Lena's tears with shaking fingers. But the moment they rose, Lena's gaze drifted past Elias toward the tent's entrance, her expression shifting from relief to terror. "He's here," she whispered. "The captain." Footsteps approached. Heavy, confident, familiar with power. Elias reacted instantly, pushing Mara and Lena behind a stack of old crates. He moved just as the tent flap lifted and a tall, broad man stepped inside. Scarred jaw, sun-leathered skin, a sneer carved so deep it seemed permanent. Well, the man drawled. "Where'd my guards go?" His eyes narrowed. His hand drifted toward the revolver on his belt. Elias stepped out from the shadows like a force carved from stone. "Looking for someone?" The captain froze. Not from fear, at least not at first, but from the recognition of a man who had come prepared to kill. Elias's stance, his eyes, the coiled fury inside him. None of it belonged to a stranger. "You." The captain laughed mockingly. "The brother of the soldier, who tried to play hero. What was his name again?" Elias didn't give him the satisfaction of finishing that sentence. He moved first. The fight broke out with a violence that felt too loud for the small tent. The two men crashed into a support pole, knocking dust and torn canvas into the air. The captain struck with brutal, heavy fists. Elias countered with precision born of experience and grief. They grappled, the tent swaying, both men grunting under the strain. Outside, shouts rose. "Something's wrong. Check the tents." Mara clutched Lena close, shielding her as Elias slammed the captain into a crate, splintering it. But the bigger man surged back with a headbutt that dropped Elias to one knee. Then came the worst moment. The captain grabbed Mara's hair and hauled her forward. "One more step," he snarled to Elias, "and she dies first." Elias froze, rage choking him. But Mara, through her pain, locked eyes with Elias and whispered, "Don't stop." The captain didn't hear it. Elias did. And he moved, fast as a striking hawk. He lunged, tackling the man with bone-rattling force. They rolled, the captain's gun skidding across the dirt. Elias reached it first. In one fluid motion, he seized it and fired. The shot echoed through the valley, cutting through wind and canvas and shouts. The captain fell. This time he stayed down. Horses neighed, and men began rushing toward the tent, but Elias didn't give them time to regroup. He hauled Mara and Lena to their feet. "Ride," he commanded, voice rough with adrenaline.
Now.
They sprinted from the tent as Elias fired twice into the air, spooking the horses tied near the fence. Chaos erupted. Men shouted. A few raised rifles but hesitated as the camp scattered in confusion. Elias threw Lena onto the mare, swung up behind Mara, and smacked Dust's flank. They raced into the dusk. The shouts faded behind them. The outpost shrank into a smear of smoke and anger. Hours later, when the mountain swallowed them again and only silence remained, they slowed. Mara clung to Lena, sobbing in quiet relief. Elias dismounted stiffly, adrenaline draining from his body like water from a cracked bucket. Mara approached him slowly. "You saved her," she said, voice trembling. "You saved both of us." Elias looked away. "Don't thank me yet. The price isn't paid." She touched his arm gently. "Then what now?" He breathed out, tired but resolute. "Now," he said, "I try to make peace with the ghosts that led us here. And maybe," his voice softened, surprising even himself, "figure out if helping you is my first step back toward living." Mara's eyes filled with a quiet, aching warmth. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something fragile and possible. Something worth the long road home.